High above the valleys of Languedoc, a fortress waited in the clouds. Montségur. Winter, 1244. Below its walls an army watched. Inside, men and women accused of heresy prepared for the end. Some would burn rather than deny their faith. But before the final surrender, a rumor slipped into the dark. Something had escaped the mountain. Treasure, documents, a secret, or perhaps nothing more than fear carried downhill by the night. And from that single uncertainty, a legend began to grow, one that would eventually bind the Cathars to the Knights Templar. But was there ever a real connection? To understand why this question survived for centuries, we have to move slowly, not straight toward the treasure, and not straight toward the conspiracy. Those are the easy paths. We need to begin with the mountain itself, with the people trapped upon it, and with the kind of silence that follows when witnesses are destroyed before they can explain what they knew. Montségur was not just a ruin in the making. It was a refuge, a symbol, and by 1244, almost a tomb suspended above the fog. Around it gathered soldiers, priests, rumors, and the long shadow of a crusade that had turned Christian against Christian in the name of purity. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe, so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. And as we begin, leave a comment letting us know where in the world you are watching from tonight. It's a reminder of how far these forgotten echoes can reach. This is not a story about proving a fantasy. It is a story about how persecution creates silence, how silence invites imagination, and how, in the ashes of Montségur, two very different histories, Cathar and Templar, began to look, to later eyes, as if they had been hiding the same secret. Chapter 2. The Heresy that Haunted Languedoc. To call the Cathars simply a heresy is already to stand inside the language of their enemies. That is one of the first difficulties in this story. Much of what we know about them comes from the people who condemned them, questioned them, hunted them, or tried to pull them back into the authority of Rome. Their own voices survive only in fragments, and often through hostile hands. Even the word Cathar is not as straightforward as it sounds. Medieval sources use different names in different places. In southern France, they were often associated with Albi, which is why later writers speak of the Albigensians. The name may sound neat, almost like a religious denomination, with a headquarters and a membership list. The reality was much messier, more local, and more human. Languedoc was not a dark corner waiting to be corrected by the north. It was a region of towns, castles, trade routes, troubadours, noble courts, and complicated loyalties. Its culture did not fit easily into the political imagination of Paris or the religious imagination of Rome. Authority there was layered. A lord might tolerate what a bishop condemned. A family might support a local priest and still invite a Cathar holy person into the home. Belief did not always move in clean lines. This is why Catharism unsettled the medieval church so deeply. It was not just that Cathar ideas were different. Difference existed everywhere. The medieval world was full of local customs, strange devotions, half-remembered practices, and arguments over doctrine. What made the Cathar challenge dangerous was that it seemed to offer a rival version of Christian seriousness. At the heart of Cathar belief was a form of dualism, the idea that the world was divided between the good realm of spirit and the corrupt realm of matter. The exact shape of that belief varied, and historians still debate how unified Cathar theology really was. But in broad terms, Cathars looked at the suffering of the physical world: hunger, disease, war, decay, greed, lust, death, and saw not merely the consequences of human sin, but evidence that the material world itself was deeply compromised. For a medieval Catholic theologian, this was not a small disagreement. Christianity taught that God had created the world, and that creation, though fallen, was fundamentally good. The body could be disciplined, tempted, weakened, even corrupted, but it was not evil by nature. The sacraments depended on matter: water in baptism, bread and wine in the Eucharist, oil in anointing, hands laid upon the penitent. The entire Catholic vision joined spirit and flesh in a way Cathar dualism threatened to undo. If matter was corrupt, then what did that mean for churches built of stone, altars dressed with cloth, bishops wearing rings and robes, priests handling consecrated bread? What did it mean for marriage, for childbirth, for oaths sworn on holy objects, for the visible hierarchy of the Church itself? This was not an abstract puzzle for scholars alone. It reached into ordinary life. Cathar teachers criticized the wealth of the Church at a time when resentment toward clerical luxury was already widespread. Many people did not need a radical theology to notice that some churchmen lived comfortably while preaching humility. They did not need a secret doctrine to see the gap between apostolic poverty and episcopal power. That gap was visible. It walked through town in fine fabric. It collected dues. It sat at tables with nobles. The Cathar holy people, by contrast, were remembered for austerity. They traveled simply. They refused meat. They avoided sexual relations. They rejected killing. They tried to live as if the world's temptations were not merely distractions, but traps. To believers tired of corruption, that discipline could look like proof. Here, at last, were people who seemed to believe what they preached. This is one of the details often missed when the Cathars are turned into symbols of mystery. Their appeal was not only theological, it was moral. In a society where violence was routine and power often protected itself with religious language, the sight of someone choosing poverty, restraint, and gentleness could be quietly explosive. They did not need armies to challenge the Church. Their lives made an accusation. And yet we should be careful not to romanticize them into modern rebels wearing medieval clothing. Catharism was not a movement of secular freedom, and it was not a simple protest against organized religion. It was intensely religious. Its discipline could be severe. Its suspicion of the body would feel alien, even troubling, to many modern viewers. The Cathars were not fighting for the same ideas people might project onto them centuries later. They were seeking salvation from a world they believed was fundamentally broken. That belief had a strange emotional power. Imagine living in a landscape where feuds could consume families, where harvests failed without warning, where disease arrived without explanation, where a violent death might come from a neighbor's quarrel or a lord's ambition. The Catholic Church offered meaning, ritual, and hope, but it was also tied to land, taxes, courts, politics, and hierarchy. Catharism offered something sharper, an explanation for why the world felt wrong. The world felt wrong because it was wrong. That kind of answer can be frightening. It can also be comforting. It gives suffering a structure. It says the cruelty you see around you is not the whole of reality. There is a purer realm beyond the visible one. There is a way to detach from corruption. There are people who have begun to do it. To Rome, however, this was not just an alternative spirituality. It was a breach in the wall. The medieval church did not see itself as one religious option among many. It understood itself as the guardian of salvation, the keeper of sacramental truth, the body through which Christian society remained ordered. Heresy, in that world, was not treated as private opinion. It was a spiritual infection that could spread through families, towns, and noble households. Modern viewers often instinctively sympathize with the persecuted, and with good reason. But to understand the decisions that followed, we have to recognize the fear operating inside the Church's own worldview. If false teaching could endanger souls eternally, then tolerating it was not neutrality. It was negligence. That does not excuse the violence that later came. It does help explain why church authorities moved from concern to urgency, and from urgency to coercion. Still, there is a revealing tension here. The Church condemned Cathar theology as a danger to Christian truth, but Cathar influence spread partly because many ordinary people believed the official Church had already failed to embody that truth. The threat was not only doctrinal, it was reputational. Every disciplined Cathar preacher made a corrupt priest look worse. Every household that welcomed a Cathar holy person quietly declared that spiritual authority did not always wear the approved vestments. That may be the deeper haunting of Languedoc. The Cathars did not conquer territory. They did not build a rival papacy. They did not march under a single banner. Much of their strength came from intimacy, conversations in homes, protection from sympathetic nobles, acts of care, networks of trust. Their faith moved through relationships before it moved through institutions. That made it hard to defeat with argument alone, because it was not merely an argument. It was woven into local loyalties and personal admiration. By the time Rome looked seriously south, it was not facing a strange idea in a book. It was facing a living religious culture, embedded in villages and courts, protected by ambiguity, and made persuasive by the failures of the very institution trying to correct it. And this is where the later legends begin to find their first raw material. A persecuted faith, a hostile record, a region proud of its difference, a church that feared contamination, a discipline that looked, to supporters, like holiness, and to enemies, like rebellion in the clothing of piety. Long before anyone tried to tie the Cathars to the Templars, the Cathars had already become something more dangerous than outsiders. They had become a mirror, chapter 3, the perfect ones and the believers. The Cathar faith did not live only in ideas, it lived in people. And like many religious movements that survive under pressure, it depended on a careful balance between the few who carried the full weight of discipline and the many who admired them, protected them, fed them, and hoped one day to receive what they had received. At the center of Cathar society stood those often called the perfects. The name can be misleading. It sounds almost arrogant, as if these men and women walked through Languedoc, announcing their own holiness. But the term comes largely through the language of outsiders and later description. A safer way to understand them is as the spiritual elite of the movement, those who had taken on the strictest obligations, the deepest renunciations, and the most visible role as guides. They were not priests in the Catholic sense. They did not stand at stone altars performing the Mass. They did not claim to transform bread and wine into the body and blood of Christ. In fact, their view of the material world made such sacramental theology deeply suspect. Their authority came from something less institutional and, in some ways, more fragile: conduct. A perfect had to be seen living differently. That mattered enormously. In a medieval town, reputation was not a decorative detail. It was proof, currency, protection, and danger all at once. People watched who ate what, who entered whose house, who spoke to whom after dusk, who traveled with whom, who seemed too close to condemned ideas. For a Cathar holy person, the body itself became a public argument. Abstaining from meat, refusing sexual relations, avoiding violence, traveling simply, speaking with restraint. These were not private lifestyle choices. They were theology made visible. There is something powerful in that, even if one does not share the belief. The perfects were persuasive because they reduced the distance between doctrine and daily life. They taught that the material world was a snare, and then they lived as if they truly believed it. That kind of consistency can unsettle an entire religious order more effectively than a clever debate. But most Cathars were not perfects. Most were believers, sympathizers, protectors, family members, householders, nobles, merchants, artisans, women managing estates, men tied to local obligations, people trying to survive in a violent world without renouncing the whole of it. They married. They had children. They ate ordinary food. They inherited property. They made compromises. They lived, in other words, like human beings usually do, somewhere between conviction and necessity. This is where the story becomes more intimate and less simple. A believer might welcome a perfect into the home, listen to teaching, offer food, arrange safe travel, or ask for blessing. A noble family might shelter Cathar holy people not because every member was a committed theologian, but because kinship, politics, admiration, and regional loyalty overlapped. In a society of personal bonds, belief rarely moved alone. It traveled with family honor, hospitality, resentment toward bishops, distrust of northern power, and the memory of who had protected whom during a feud. The Cathar movement survived because it had a structure flexible enough to include both radical renunciation and ordinary attachment. The perfects embodied the ideal. The believers kept the ideal alive in the world it rejected. That tension is easy to criticize, but it is also deeply human. A faith that demanded total purity from everyone would probably have remained tiny. A faith that demanded purity from no one would have lost its edge. Catharism found a middle space. A small number would live the hard life now, while others supported them, honored them, and hoped for mercy at the end. This hope centered on the consolamentum. The consolamentum was the key Cathar rite, often described as a spiritual baptism. It was not baptism by water, because water belonged to the material world and could not, in their eyes, carry the kind of salvation Catholics claimed for it. Instead, it involved prayer, the laying on of hands, and the transmission of spiritual grace. For the perfects, receiving it marked entry into the strict life. For ordinary believers, it was often desired near death, when the demands of the perfect life would not have to be carried for long. To modern ears, that can sound like a loophole. Live normally, receive the rite at the end, and depart purified. Medieval Catholic critics certainly saw danger in it. But from inside the emotional world of the believers, it may have felt less like cheating than like mercy. Not everyone could abandon marriage, property, food, family, and worldly obligations. Not everyone could walk the road as a holy person. Yet the longing for purity remained. There is a quiet sadness in that arrangement. It acknowledges that the ideal life is almost impossible for most people, while refusing to lower the ideal itself. The believers lived in the compromised world, but they kept their eyes fixed on those who seemed to have escaped its gravity. This helps explain why the perfects were so threatening. They were not just teaching against Catholic sacraments. They were offering a rival model of sanctity. A bishop could condemn them, but if the bishop was known for wealth or political maneuvering, the condemnation might not land as intended. The contrast was too visible. A barefoot or simply dressed holy person, moving from house to house with no apparent interest in luxury, could make official authority look heavy, expensive, and strangely earthbound. Women also appear in Cathar life in ways that deserve attention. Female perfects existed, and for some women in Languedoc, the movement may have offered forms of spiritual agency not easily available elsewhere. This should not be exaggerated into a modern fantasy of perfect equality. The medieval world remained the medieval world. But the presence of women as recognized religious figures complicates the picture. It suggests that Cathar communities could create spaces of authority outside the normal clerical structure, and that alone would have made them harder for the Church to ignore. The emotional appeal of Catharism was not that it made life easier. In many ways, it made life harder. It asked people to distrust the world around them, to see the body as a prison, to regard ordinary pleasures with suspicion. But it also gave moral clarity in an age crowded with compromise. It told believers that the violence and greed surrounding them were not accidents to be explained away. They were signs of a deeper disorder. That message could wound, but it could also comfort. A mother who had lost a child, a farmer ruined by war, a household disgusted by clerical corruption, a minor noble caught between larger powers. Each might hear in Cathar teaching a severe but coherent answer. The world hurts because it is not your true home. The soul belongs elsewhere. Purity is possible, but it must be chosen against the grain of everything visible. This is not a cheerful religion. It is not designed for ease. Its beauty, if we can call it that, lies in its refusal to flatter the world. And yet its survival depended on the very world it rejected. Perfects needed roads, houses, food, guides, warnings, and friends. They needed believers who still owned property, managed kitchens, negotiated with lords, and understood the practical geography of danger. The movement's spiritual purity rested on a foundation of ordinary human loyalty. That contradiction does not make the Cathars hypocrites. It makes them historically real. Later legend often turns persecuted groups into guardians of perfect secrets, as if suffering automatically purifies everything it touches. The actual Cathar world was more complicated and more interesting. It contained courage, severity, tenderness, fear, compromise, and hope. Its people were not symbols waiting to be used by later conspiracies. They were men and women trying to live inside a terrifying question. How can a soul remain clean in a world it believes is corrupt? The answer, for the perfects, was renunciation. For the believers, it was trust. And between those two paths, a hidden network of faith took shape across Languedoc. Quiet enough to pass through doorways, strong enough to alarm Rome, and vulnerable enough that once the machinery of persecution began to move, every act of hospitality could become evidence. Chapter 4. Rome looks south. For a time, Rome did not answer Languedoc with armies. That matters. because the later violence can make the whole story look inevitable, as if the church simply saw a rival belief and reached at once for the sword. The truth is more uncomfortable. Before the crusade, there were years of preaching, missions, disputes, warnings, reforms attempted too late, and arguments staged in public before people who already knew which holy men they trusted. The papacy looked south and saw a region slipping out of its grasp, but not in a single dramatic rebellion. It was subtler than that. Bishops complained. Local clergy seemed weak or compromised. Nobles were evasive. Townspeople could be polite without being obedient. Cathar holy people moved through the social landscape with the protection of families who knew exactly when to speak plainly and when to say nothing useful at all. To an institution built on visible authority, this kind of quiet resistance was maddening. The church could summon councils, issue condemnations, send preachers, and demand cooperation. But belief inside a household is not easily dragged into the open. A lord might insist he was loyal to the church while tolerating Cathar teachers on his lands. A woman might attend Catholic rites because public life required it, then ask for Cathar consolation at the edge of death. A town might receive an official preacher with courtesy and still return by evening to its older sympathies. This was not a battlefield yet. It was a contest for credibility. The papacy understood, at least partly, that the church's own reputation was part of the problem. If Cathar austerity made Catholic wealth look obscene, then more sermons alone would not repair the damage. Some reform-minded churchmen tried to meet the challenge by preaching with poverty, simplicity, and discipline. They understood that to defeat a movement admired for holiness, official religion had to look holy again. That is a crucial detail. Rome did not only fear Cathar doctrine, it feared the comparison. A richly dressed cleric denouncing a barefoot ascetic could accidentally make the ascetic more persuasive. A bishop speaking of obedience might not move people who had watched local church offices behave like political prizes. The church's problem in Languedoc was not that no one had heard its message. Many had heard it all their lives. The problem was that some people no longer believed the messenger. So the response began with persuasion. Papal legates traveled through the region. Monks and preachers argued doctrine. Public debates were held. Reform was urged. Pressure was placed on local rulers to root out heresy. The language hardened, but the method still depended on correction rather than conquest. Yet every failed mission deepened the sense in Rome that ordinary remedies were not enough. It is worth pausing here, because this is where history often becomes morally slippery. Institutions rarely leap from anxiety to violence in one motion. They build a case for necessity. They tell themselves patience has been tried. They gather examples of defiance. They interpret hesitation as guilt. They begin to see every local compromise as part of a larger infection. By the time force appears, it can be presented not as a choice, but as the only remaining tool. In Languedoc, the figure who came to embody this escalation was Pierre de Castelnau, a papal legate and Cistercian monk. He was not a soldier, but he carried the authority of a papacy increasingly impatient with southern resistance. His work placed him in direct conflict with the tangled politics of the region, especially with powerful nobles who were expected to suppress heresy, but often acted with caution, self-interest, or open reluctance. Among them was Count Raymond VI of Toulouse, one of the great lords of the south. Raymond's position was difficult, though not necessarily noble in the romantic sense. He ruled in a world where faith, family, land, reputation, and survival all pressed against one another. To move too harshly against Cathar sympathizers could destabilize his own society. To resist the papacy too openly could invite disaster. He became, in Roman eyes, a symbol of southern failure, too tolerant, too evasive, too entangled with the world heresy needed in order to survive. Pierre de Castelnau excommunicated Raymond, a severe spiritual and political blow. Excommunication was not merely a private religious penalty. It could loosen bonds of loyalty, damage legitimacy, and mark a ruler as unsafe to obey. In a society where authority depended on sacred recognition, it was a weapon without a blade. Then, in January 1208, Pierre de Castelnau was murdered. The killing took place after a period of bitter conflict, and suspicion quickly fell toward Raymond's circle, though the exact responsibility remains a matter that has to be handled carefully. What mattered most in the moment was not a courtroom standard of proof. What mattered was how the death was interpreted. To the papacy, the murder of a legate was not simply a crime. It was an attack on the Church's own body. A messenger of Rome had been struck down while confronting heresy and noble defiance. In that atmosphere, the killing became the spark that could make war sound righteous. This is one of those moments where a single violent act changes the scale of a crisis. Before the murder, Languedoc was a troubled region requiring discipline. After it, the South could be portrayed as a place where heresy had grown so bold that even the Pope's representative could be killed. Whether that interpretation was fair in every detail mattered less than its power. It gave outrage a direction, and outrage, when joined to theology, can become policy very quickly. Pope Innocent III called for armed action. The language of crusade, already sanctified by campaigns to the eastern Mediterranean, was turned toward a Christian land. This did not mean every person who joined understood Cathar doctrine or cared deeply about theological nuance. Crusading offered spiritual reward, social prestige, and for some northern nobles, the possibility of land. Once the idea of holy war crossed into Languedoc, it brought more than religious punishment. It opened the door to ambition. That is the dark hinge of this story. The Church's fear of heresy met the appetite of armed men. Still, we should not reduce the papal response to simple greed, nor excuse it as pure spiritual concern. It was both more complex and more dangerous. Many church leaders sincerely believed heresy endangered souls. Many secular lords sincerely saw opportunity. Some participants may have believed they were saving Christendom. Others likely saw estates, castles, titles, and influence. Medieval violence rarely arrived with only one motive. The murder of Pierre de Castelnau allowed these motives to travel together. From Rome's perspective, preaching had failed. Debate had failed. Local enforcement had failed. Reform had not moved quickly enough. A papal representative was dead. The conclusion seemed clear to those who wanted clarity. Languedoc would have to be purified by force. But force has a way of changing the thing it claims to defend. Once armies enter a religious dispute, the question is no longer only what people believe. It becomes who owns the land, who commands the castles, who collects the taxes, who survives the siege, and who gets to write the record afterward. That is why 1208 is so important. Not because everything before it was peaceful, it was not. And not because the murder explains everything that followed. It does not. But it gave the papacy a story powerful enough to gather men under a cross and send them south. The Cathars had haunted Languedoc as a spiritual problem. Now they would be pursued as enemies in a holy war. Chapter 5. A Crusade Against Christians. In the summer of 1209, the language of holy war crossed a dangerous boundary. For generations, crusading had been imagined as a journey outward, toward Jerusalem, toward lands held by Muslims, toward sacred geography made distant by both faith and politics. The cross sewn onto a warrior's clothing meant hardship, pilgrimage, penance, and violence directed beyond the borders of Latin Christendom. Now that same symbol was carried into southern France. The men who came south were not entering an unknown world. They were marching into towns where church bells rang, where people were baptized, where saints' days were observed, where Latin prayers could be heard, where the landscape was unmistakably Christian. That is what gives the Albigensian Crusade its unsettling force. It was not simply a campaign against a doctrine. It was a moment when the machinery of crusade, once pointed outward, was turned inward against people who lived inside the same religious civilization. The target was heresy. The army, however, moved through land. That difference mattered from the beginning. The Crusaders who gathered in 1209 included great and lesser nobles from northern France, along with clerics, knights, foot soldiers, and men drawn by the promises attached to crusading. Some came out of conviction. Some came out of obligation. Some came because war, when blessed, could become opportunity in armor. The spiritual reward of crusade made the campaign righteous in theory, but the practical geography of Languedoc offered castles, influence, ransom, and possession. This was the moment when religious fear and territorial ambition became hard to separate. The first great shock came at Béziers. The city had Catholics as well as suspected heretics, and that fact has haunted accounts of the siege ever since. The crusading army demanded that the heretics be handed over. The city did not comply. Whether out of solidarity, confusion, fear, civic pride, or the impossibility of neatly separating neighbor from neighbor, Béziers resisted. The result was catastrophic. Later tradition attaches to this event one of the most infamous lines of the Middle Ages: "Kill them all, God will know his own." The words are attributed to the papal legate Arnaud Amalric, though the evidence for the exact quote is debated and comes through later reporting. It may be too neat, too perfectly monstrous, to trust without caution. But the reason the phrase endured is revealing. Even if the sentence was shaped by memory, polemic, or horror after the fact, it captured something people recognized about the massacre: the terrifying collapse of distinction. Cathar or Catholic, guilty or innocent, believer or neighbor. In the fury of the assault, those categories no longer protected the living. This is where the crusade announces its true danger. A war fought to purify belief must still use men with weapons, and weapons do not examine doctrine. They enter streets, they burn doors, they follow panic. Once a city becomes an example, theology gives way to terror. Béziers was not only an act of violence, it was a message. Other towns understood it. So did the nobles of Languedoc. Resistance could bring not a clean legal judgment, but destruction. The Crusades' power lay not merely in defeating armies, but in making communities calculate the price of survival. A town did not need to be fully Cathar to fear what might happen if it was accused of sheltering them. After Béziers came Carcassonne, one of the great fortified centers of the region. The city surrendered after siege and pressure, and its fall helped reshape the balance of power. The young Viscount Raymond Roger Trencavel, who had ruled Béziers and Carcassonne, became one of the early casualties of the political collapse around the Crusade. He died in captivity later that year, leaving behind a memory easily absorbed into Southern grievance. A local lord crushed beneath a campaign that claimed to be saving souls. Into the vacuum stepped Simon de Montfort. He is one of the central figures of the Crusade, and one of the hardest to treat fairly because his image depends so much on where one stands. To supporters, he could be presented as a disciplined Christian warrior, a man carrying out the Church's will against dangerous heresy. To enemies, especially in Southern memory, he became the face of conquest, northern severity riding under a sacred banner. Both images are too simple on their own. Simon de Montfort was not merely a brute in religious costume, nor was he simply a pious instrument of justice. He was a crusading noble in a world where faith, honor, violence, and acquisition could live in the same conscience without seeming contradictory. He fought with conviction, but conviction did not prevent him from taking power. In fact, it may have made power feel deserved. That is one of the uncomfortable lessons of the Albigensian Crusade. People do not have to be cynical to do terrible things. A man can believe he serves God and still benefit from the ruin of his enemies. He can pray, fast, obey, command, punish, and seize land, while understanding all of it as part of one moral order. For the people of Languedoc, that moral order arrived as occupation. Castles were taken. Lords were dispossessed. Oaths were demanded. The old networks that had allowed Cathar believers and perfects to survive became increasingly dangerous. A household that once offered shelter could become a liability. A noble who once tolerated religious dissent had to choose between resistance, compromise, or humiliation. The Crusade pushed private loyalties into public crisis. It also changed the meaning of heresy itself. Before armies marched south, heresy could be imagined as a spiritual disease, a doctrinal error, a hidden corruption of belief. After 1209, it became tied to siegecraft, confiscation, and lordship. To be accused of protecting heresy was not only to risk the soul, it was to risk inheritance. Land could be transferred through the language of purification. Political submission could be framed as religious correction. This is why the Crusade cannot be understood as theology with swords added later. The swords altered the theology's social meaning. They made belief a matter of maps, and yet Catharism did not vanish at the first shock. That is important. Violence can destroy communities, but it does not always erase conviction. Sometimes it hardens it. Sometimes it drives it into more careful forms. Perfects continued to move, believers continued to hide them, and sympathy could survive beneath outward obedience. In a region built on kinship and memory, force could conquer a castle faster than it could persuade a grandmother, a cousin, a widow, or a servant who had once seen a holy person bless the dying. The Crusade's brutality also created its own counter-memory. Every siege, every dispossession, every northern lord rewarded with southern lands added weight. Suspicion that this was not only about saving souls. People may have feared heresy, but they also recognized conquest when it arrived at their gates. That recognition matters for the later legend. Centuries afterward, when people tried to imagine the Cathars as keepers of a hidden truth, they were not starting from nothing. They inherited the memory of a real persecution, a real crusade, and a real region broken under the combined pressure of faith and power. Legends grow best where official explanations leave moral discomfort behind. The Church said it fought error. The victors claimed order. But the ruins suggested another story as well, that a society had been remade by men who came with crosses on their cloaks and claims on other people's homes. The Albigensian Crusade did not create the Cathar mystery by itself. It created the wound in which mystery could take root. Because once Christian blood had been spilled by Christian hands in the name of holy war, the question could no longer be contained inside doctrine. It had become a question of what sacred power is capable of doing when it decides that mercy would be weakness. Chapter 6: Faith, Land, and Power. By the time the crusade had settled into the landscape, the question of belief could no longer be separated from the question of ownership. That is one of the hardest truths in the story of Languedoc. The campaign began in the language of salvation. It spoke of heresy, purity, obedience, and the rescue of souls. But armies do not move through theology alone. They need roads, supplies, castles, alliances, rewards. They pass through vineyards, fields, mills, river crossings, market towns, and fortified hills. They enter the practical world, where every spiritual decision has a political shadow. In southern France, that shadow grew long. Before the Crusade, Languedoc was not a single independent kingdom standing neatly apart from France. The political situation was more complicated. A web of counts, viscounts, bishops, towns, family claims, and overlapping loyalties. Authority was negotiated as much as imposed. The Count of Toulouse, the Trencavels, local lords, urban communities, and outside powers all had interests that crossed and collided. It was a region used to complexity. That complexity helped Catharism survive. It created spaces where enforcement could be delayed, softened, or quietly ignored. A bishop might condemn, but a noble might hesitate. A preacher might denounce, but a household might protect. A count might promise obedience to Rome while managing a society in which too many influential families had Cathar sympathies, Cathar relatives, or simply Cathar friends. From the papal point of view, this looked like weakness or complicity. From the southern point of view, it may have looked like the only way to keep the peace. The crusade broke that delicate arrangement. Once northern nobles entered the war, punishment could become replacement. Lands confiscated from those accused of protecting heresy did not remain empty. Castles taken in the name of religious correction became prizes of lordship. The campaign did not merely attack a belief system. It rearranged who had the right to command. Simon de Montfort's rise made this unmistakable. He was not simply defeating Cathar sympathizers and going home. He was building power in the south, taking titles, claiming authority, and establishing a new order under the moral cover of crusade. To his supporters, this was justice. Lands polluted by heresy were being placed in loyal hands. To many in Languedoc, it looked like conquest with a sermon attached. Both descriptions explain part of the reality. This is where modern storytelling often makes the mistake of choosing only one motive. Either the crusade was a sincere religious campaign, or it was a cynical land grab. But history is usually less tidy and more troubling than that. The crusade could be sincerely religious and politically profitable at the same time. Its participants did not have to choose between faith and ambition when the culture around them allowed the two to reinforce each other. A noble could believe he was fighting heresy while also accepting a castle. A cleric could believe he was defending souls while blessing a transfer of power. A king could remain formally cautious while recognizing that the weakening of southern lords served the long-term interests of the French crown. That last point is essential. The Albigensian Crusade was not only a church story. It became part of the slow expansion of Capetian influence into the south. The French monarchy did not instantly absorb Languedoc in one dramatic gesture, but the Crusade damaged the old southern aristocracy and created conditions that favored royal intervention. The region's autonomy, already complicated, was steadily reduced. The Treaty of Paris in 1229 marked a major stage in this transformation. Raymond VII of Toulouse, son of Raymond VI, submitted under severe terms. His power was limited. Fortifications were effected. Marriage arrangements tied the future of Toulouse to the French royal house. The settlement did not erase all local identity, but it made clear that the old balance had been broken. The South would not return to the world that existed before the Crusaders came. This is why the destruction of Catharism cannot be understood only as the defeat of a heresy. It was also the remaking of a region, and for the people living through it, those two processes must have felt inseparable. To denounce heresy was also to identify enemies. To identify enemies was to justify confiscation. To confiscate land was to change power. To change power was to alter which memories could be spoken safely. When a religious campaign produces new landlords, everyone learns to listen differently. Imagine a family in a town that had once hosted Cathar perfects. Before the Crusade, perhaps everyone knew, and no one said much. After the Crusade, the same memory could become dangerous. The new authority might ask questions. A rival might inform. A servant might repeat something heard years earlier. A neighbor might protect himself by naming others. Faith, once carried through trust, now moved through fear. Politics changed the emotional weather of belief. It is also important to notice how power uses categories. Cathar, heretic, protector of heretics, reconciled, suspect, loyal. These were not just descriptions. They were tools. They sorted people into danger or safety. They could attach to property, inheritance, reputation, and marriage prospects. In a society where written records, oaths, and testimony mattered increasingly, being placed in the wrong category could follow a family like a stain. The Crusade made the category of heresy more useful to rulers. That does not mean the heresy was invented. Cathar belief was real. Its challenge to Catholic doctrine was real. Its networks were real. But the political usefulness of suppressing it was also real. A dangerous belief can exist, and powerful people can still exploit the campaign against it. Those two things are not opposites. This is the distinction that keeps the story honest. If we reduce the Cathars to innocent victims of politics, we erase their actual religious convictions. If we reduce the Crusade to a pure defense of doctrine, we ignore the land, titles, and royal influence that followed in its wake. The truth lies in the uneasy meeting point. A spiritual conflict became a political opportunity, and the opportunity made the conflict more destructive. For Languedoc, the consequences lasted far beyond the burning of individual believers. The old culture of tolerance, or at least practical coexistence, narrowed. Local lords learned the cost of ambiguity. Towns learned the cost of resistance. The church learned that force, once used, demanded administration afterward. The French crown learned that a fractured south could be drawn more firmly into its orbit, and the Cathars, who had once moved through the region by personal trust, found themselves increasingly trapped inside systems of surveillance, confession, and punishment. This is why the later image of Languedoc as a land of hidden secrets is not entirely born from fantasy. Something was hidden there. Not necessarily a grail, not necessarily Templar knowledge, not necessarily a treasure chest carried through mountain passes. What was hidden often was memory itself. Families hid loyalties. Villages hid histories. Survivors hid names. A region that had once been difficult to govern became a place where speech had consequences. That kind of silence leaves marks. Centuries later, when writers searched the ruins for mysteries, they often looked for objects: gold, manuscripts, sacred relics, coded truths. But the deeper transformation was less cinematic and more severe. The crusade turned belief into evidence into punishment, and punishment into a new political order. Languedoc was not simply corrected. It was absorbed, disciplined, and taught that the price of spiritual disobedience could be paid in land. Chapter 7. The Other Order of the Cross. While Languedoc was being pulled into crusade, another institution of the medieval church was already casting a long shadow across Europe. The Knights Templar did not begin as a legend. They began with a practical problem on a dangerous road. After the First Crusade, Christian armies had taken Jerusalem in 1099, and the Holy Land became the focus of intense pilgrimage from Western Europe. Men and women crossed seas, deserts, mountain passes, and hostile territories to reach the places associated with the life of Christ. But devotion did not make the roads safe. Pilgrims could be robbed, attacked, or killed long before they ever reached the holy city. Out of that danger came a small brotherhood of knights. Their early purpose was simple enough to understand: protect pilgrims in the Latin East. They were warriors, but not merely warriors. They took religious vows. They lived under discipline. They were eventually recognized and supported by the papacy. Their headquarters, according to tradition, stood near the site associated with the Temple of Solomon. And from that association came the name that would outlive almost everything else about them: Templars. Already, the ingredients of future myth were present: a sacred city, armed monks, the temple, vows, secrecy, papal privilege. It is almost unfair to history how easily the imagination can work with such material. But before they became symbols in conspiracy books and treasure stories, the Templars were an institution, organized, wealthy, useful, and deeply embedded in the practical world of medieval power. Their rise was extraordinary. Donations flowed to them from kings, nobles, and ordinary believers who wanted to support the defense of the Holy Land, gain spiritual merit, or place resources in the hands of an order trusted to serve a sacred cause. Land was given. Money was entrusted. Estates were managed. Commanderies appeared across Europe, including in France. The Templars became not only a military order in the East, but a network in the West. Farming, banking, transporting funds, holding property, and moving men and resources across great distances. This is where their image becomes complicated. A Templar was supposed to be a poor knight of Christ, bound by obedience and discipline. Yet the order itself became immensely rich. Individual brothers might live under vows, but the institution owned lands, collected revenues, and dealt with rulers. This contradiction did not make the Templars unusual in the medieval church. Monasteries could be wealthy while monks took vows of poverty. Bishops could preach humility while commanding estates. But in the case of the Templars, the contrast was especially striking because they combined holiness, violence, money, and secrecy in one recognizable form. They were religious men who carried swords. They were poor brothers inside a rich order. They were servants of the church who answered directly to the Pope, often standing partly outside local control. For admirers, this made them powerful guardians of Christendom. For critics, it made them difficult to trust. And yet, during the age of the Albigensian Crusade, the Templars were not the same thing as the Cathars. That sounds obvious, but it needs to be said plainly because later legend tends to blur silhouettes. The Cathars rejected key teachings of the Catholic Church. The Templars were a Catholic military order created within the Church, protected by the Church, and tasked with defending Christian interests as the Church understood them. Their official identities were not parallel heresies. They belonged to opposite categories. Still, they moved through some of the same wider world. Templar commanderies existed in southern France. Noble families who donated to the order might also be entangled in the politics of Languedoc. Roads used by merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and messengers could carry many kinds of loyalties. A knightly household might know the Templars through land transactions, and know Cathar sympathizers through marriage. Medieval society was not organized into sealed boxes labeled Orthodox, Heretic, Crusader, and Neighbor, and people lived in webs. Those webs are where suspicion later found room to breathe. The Templars also had a quality the Cathars did not: institutional opacity. Their internal life was governed by rules, hierarchy, ceremonies, and obedience. Outsiders did not see everything. That is not the same as sinister secrecy. Every religious order had internal customs, and every military organization had discipline not meant for public entertainment. But when an order becomes powerful, wealthy, and partially shielded from local authorities, ordinary privacy can start to look like concealment. The medieval imagination did not need much encouragement here. People wondered what happened behind closed doors. They wondered where the money went. They wondered why these warrior monks held privileges denied to others. Even admiration can curdle into unease when an institution becomes too successful. There is also the matter of violence. The Templars were born from crusade, and crusade gave them meaning. They existed because holy war had become a recognized form of Christian service. The Cathars, by contrast, were victims of crusading when that sacred violence turned inward. This creates a grim symmetry, but not a proven connection. One group served the crusading ideal, the other suffered beneath it. Later storytellers noticed the shared atmosphere of crosses, vows, accusations, and fire, then began drawing lines that the evidence itself does not firmly draw. That distinction will matter again and again. A parallel is not an alliance. Proximity is not proof. Shared geography is not shared doctrine. Still, the Templars enter this story because they represent another face of the same medieval world that destroyed Catharism. A world where salvation, authority, land, secrecy, and violence were braided together so tightly that separating them becomes difficult even for careful historians. To understand the Templars only as brave defenders is too clean. To understand them only as corrupt occult conspirators is worse. They were neither cardboard saints nor hidden villains. They were a disciplined religious military corporation operating across borders in an age when faith was not private, war was not secular, and wealth could be justified as service to God. That made them effective. It also made them vulnerable, because the very features that gave the Templars strength, their papal protection, their wealth, their internal rituals, their international network, Their aura of sacred purpose would later make them easy to accuse. When political winds shifted, privilege could be reinterpreted as arrogance. Discipline could be recast as secrecy. Ceremony could become suspicious. Wealth could look like corruption. A closed door could become, in the mind of an enemy, a chamber of blasphemy. In the 13th century, however, they still stood as one of the great orders of the cross. Their reputation had not yet collapsed. Their red cross remained a sign of service, sacrifice, and war under divine authority. Across Europe, their houses gathered resources for the East, held lands, and moved within the highest circles of power. Far from Montségur, they seemed to belong to a different story. But history has a habit of letting separate stories touch at the edges, not because every contact hides a secret plan, but because memory does not preserve boundaries as carefully as archives try to. The Cathars left behind ashes and interrogations. The Templars left behind charters, commanderies, privileges, and eventually, confessions extracted under terror. One movement was condemned for rejecting the church. The other would be destroyed after serving it. Between them lay no proven hidden doctrine, no secure bridge of forbidden wisdom. But there was a shared medieval landscape, anxious, violent, devotional, political, and hungry for enemies it could name. That landscape would later allow the two histories to be folded together, until a persecuted faith and a military order began to look, in the imagination, like two halves of the same buried secret. Chapter 8. Why the Templars enter the Cathar story. The link between the Cathars and the Templars did not begin as a solid bridge. It began more like a shadow cast from two different objects, falling across the same wall. On one side were the Cathars, condemned as heretics, rooted in parts of southern France, remembered through persecution, fire, and silence. On the other side were the Templars, Catholic warrior monks, wealthy and privileged, later accused of secret crimes and destroyed by the very Christian powers they had served. Their stories were not the same. Their beliefs were not the same. Their official roles in medieval society were almost opposite, and yet later imagination kept pulling them together. The reason is not hard to understand. History leaves facts, but it also leaves shapes. And the shapes of these two stories resemble one another just enough to tempt the eye. Both involve secrecy, or at least the appearance of secrecy. Cathar communities survived through private trust, hidden sympathies, coded caution, and domestic spaces where faith could pass quietly from one person to another. The Templars, meanwhile, possessed the ordinary secrecy of a closed religious order. Internal rites, private chapters, rules of obedience, and an institutional life outsiders could not easily inspect. In neither case does secrecy automatically prove dark knowledge. Much of medieval life was private because privacy protected authority, discipline, or survival. But to later readers, especially those already hungry for mystery, hidden rooms and hidden believers begin to look like the same kind of darkness. They are not the same, but they rhyme. Geography helped the connection grow. The Templars had houses and properties across France, including in the south. Catharism flourished in parts of the same broad region. Noble families in Languedoc might have dealings with Templar commanderies, while also being related to, sympathetic toward, or accused of protecting Cathar believers. That does not create an alliance. Medieval aristocratic society was dense with overlapping obligations. The same family could donate to a monastery, quarrel with a bishop, marry into a suspect lineage, shelter a relative, and give land to a military order without seeing those actions as contradictory. But for later storytellers, overlap is powerful. A map can mislead the imagination. Put two phenomena in the same region, add persecution, add missing records, add castles, add mountains, and the mind begins to draw lines. The lines may be elegant, they may even feel inevitable, but elegance is not evidence. The more careful question is not, could Cathars and Templars have crossed paths? Of course they could have. In a world of roads, markets, donations, kinship, and war, many people crossed paths. The better question is, what kind of contact can be proven, and what meaning can responsibly be attached to it? That question is less exciting, but it is where history begins to defend itself from fantasy. Still, fantasy had help from the record itself. The Cathars were accused of heresy. The Templars were later accused of heresy. To the modern ear, the repeated accusation creates an echo, as if the same hidden current ran beneath both cases. But medieval accusations of heresy were not always precise instruments. They could describe real doctrinal dissent, as in the case of Catharism. They could also be shaped by fear, politics, greed, rivalry, or the need to destroy an institution without appearing merely ambitious. The word heresy carried immense force because it did more than criticize. It marked a person or group as spiritually dangerous, socially contagious, and legally vulnerable. That is one of the deep connections between the two stories. Not necessarily shared belief, but shared vulnerability to a system that could define enemies through theology. Catharism genuinely challenged Catholic doctrine. The Templars, at least officially and institutionally, did not begin as doctrinal rebels. Yet when the Templars fell in the early 14th century, their enemies used accusations that placed them beyond the moral protection normally given to servants of the Church. Charges of blasphemy, obscene rites, and corruption transformed them from honored warriors into a kind of internal disease. The pattern feels familiar because power often repeats the language that has worked before. This is not proof of a Cathar influence on the Templars. It is proof that medieval authority knew how to turn suspicion into a weapon. The crusading atmosphere also matters. The Templars existed because crusade had become holy service. The Cathars were crushed when crusade became holy punishment within Europe. Both stories belong to the same wider experiment, the attempt to sanctify violence by attaching it to salvation. That experiment did not always produce the same result. In the East, it produced military orders like the Templars. In Languedoc, it produced sieges against Christian towns. Later generations, looking back, saw crosses on cloaks, accusations of impurity, fire, vows, secret rites, and ruined strongholds. The pieces seem to belong together. But resemblance can be a trap. A red cross on a Templar mantle and a Cathar refusal of Catholic sacraments do not point to the same theology. A noble who supports a Templar house and protects a Cathar relative is not automatically a member of a secret network. A rumor of treasure leaving Montségur does not become Templar because the Templars were rich, mobile, and mysterious. These connections are emotionally satisfying, but history asks for something colder. Documents, testimony, patterns that cannot be explained more simply. The evidence is thinner than the legend wants it to be, and yet, the legend survives because it answers a need that bare history often frustrates. The fall of the Cathars feels unfinished. So many of their own words are missing. So many survivors were interrogated through hostile. The burning at Montségur feels like an ending that begs for something to have escaped. A treasure, a gospel, a bloodline, a doctrine, a name. Anything that prevents the story from ending only in defeat. The Templars offer later imagination, a vessel for that escape. They were organized, mobile, international, wealthy, and secretive enough in appearance to carry almost any rumor placed upon them. If something left Montségur, why not imagine it reaching the hands of men who had commanderies, horses, ships, contacts, and a reputation for guarding sacred things? This is how legends often work. They borrow the strongest available container. The Templars became that container. There is also an emotional justice in the imagined link. The Cathars were persecuted by Catholic authority. The Templars were later destroyed by Catholic monarchy with papal cooperation. To connect them is to create a hidden brotherhood of the condemned, two groups crushed by institutions that feared what they could not control. This may be moving, but it is also too neat. It turns very different histories into a single moral parable. It comforts us by making the past more symmetrical than it was. Real history is less tidy. The Templars were not natural allies of Cathar dualism. They were Catholic soldiers bound to a church the Cathars rejected. Many Templars would likely have viewed Cathar teaching as dangerous or false. Some may have operated near regions of Cathar sympathy without sharing anything more than roads, donors, or political weather. Human proximity is not spiritual kinship, but the connection enters the story because human beings are not satisfied by proximity alone. We want hidden meaning. We want persecuted people to have passed down something precious. We want powerful institutions to have feared more than mere disobedience. We want the ashes to conceal a map. The Cathar Templar legend grew because it turns historical trauma into a mystery with survivors. It gives the silence after Montségur a plot. It gives the Templars' later destruction a deeper cause. It suggests that beneath official records, another history moved hand to hand, protected by those who knew better than to speak. That possibility is seductive, but seduction is not the same as truth. What we can say with more confidence is that the Cathars and Templars became linked in memory because their stories share the ingredients from which conspiracy is easily made. Secrecy, sacred violence, southern French geography, noble networks, accusations of heresy, missing voices, and dramatic destruction. Each ingredient is real. The recipe built from them is much less certain. The danger is not in asking whether they touched. The danger is in mistaking the beauty of the question for the strength of the answer. Chapter 9. The evidence that refuses to speak. The problem with a beautiful theory is that it can make silence sound like consent. That is especially true in the story of the Cathars and the Templars. Once the two names are placed side by side, the imagination begins doing quiet work. It notices that both belonged to the same broad medieval world. It notices that both were tied, in different ways, to southern France. It notices that both became targets of accusation. It notices that both ended under the pressure of authority, confession, and fire. Then it asks the tempting question: surely this cannot be coincidence. But coincidence is not the same as emptiness. It is often the normal texture of history. Many people, institutions, and beliefs inhabit the same century without belonging to one another. The 13th century was crowded with crusaders, merchants, monks, Bishops, heretics, nobles, widows, notaries, debtors, pilgrims, and soldiers. Their lives overlapped constantly. Roads overlapped. Families overlapped. Legal documents overlapped. Fear overlapped. Meaning did not always follow. This is where the evidence becomes stubborn. It does not give the clean answer the legend wants. The Templars were present in regions where Catharism had influence. That much is not shocking. The order had properties and commanderies across parts of France, and Languedoc was not sealed away from the rest of Christian Europe. Templar houses needed land, donations, supplies, relationships, and protection. They dealt with local elites because local elites were the people who owned land and made gifts. Some of those same elites lived in communities where Cathar sympathy existed, or where relatives had been accused, protected, reconciled, or quietly suspected. So yes, there was contact in the broad social sense, but the word contact is doing a great deal of work. A charter recording a donation does not prove shared doctrine. A noble family with Cathar sympathies giving land to a Templar house does not prove the Templars accepted Cathar beliefs. A Templar commandery standing within reach of Cathar networks does not prove it served as a hidden passageway for heretical teachings. Medieval institutions routinely accepted gifts from morally complicated people. If every donation implied spiritual agreement, the entire map of medieval religion would become nonsense. The more careful reading is less dramatic, but more durable. The Templars and Cathars occupied overlapping social terrain, not necessarily a shared religious mission. That distinction may sound small. It is not. It is the difference between history and architecture built from fog. When historians look for an organized Cathar-Templar alliance, they need something stronger than proximity. They need records that show cooperation with a clear purpose. They need testimony that cannot be explained as rumor, coercion, misunderstanding, or later invention. They need signs of shared teaching, shared ritual, deliberate protection, or institutional sympathy. The surviving evidence does not comfortably provide that. This does not mean no individual Templar ever knew a Cathar, spoke with a Cathar, sheltered a relative, or held private opinions that would have made his superiors uneasy. Medieval people were not machines stamped with the official doctrine of their order. A man could belong to an orthodox institution and still have family ties in suspect circles. He could be loyal, conflicted, ignorant, pragmatic, or careless. He could live near heresy without becoming a heretic. He could even show kindness without joining a conspiracy. The evidence allows for human messiness. It does not support a grand hidden brotherhood. One reason the legend feels plausible is that both Cathars and Templars were later seen through hostile records. The Cathars appear in sermons, condemnations, inquisitorial files, and the memories of communities under pressure. The Templars, after their arrest, appear in accusations and confessions shaped by imprisonment and torture. In both cases, the archive is not a neutral window. It is a room where power has already arranged the furniture. That should make us cautious in two directions at once. We should not accept every accusation at face value. Medieval authorities could misunderstand, exaggerate, or weaponize charges, but we also should not treat the corruption of a record as permission to invent whatever we prefer. A damaged source is not an empty page. It can be read carefully, compared, weighed, doubted, and sometimes trusted in part. But it cannot be made to confess the opposite of what it says simply because the opposite is more exciting. This is where many conspiracy traditions take a wrong turn. They begin with a reasonable observation that official records can be biased, and then leap to an unreasonable conclusion that the absence of proof is itself proof of successful concealment. If no document shows a Templar-Cathar alliance, the theory says, that only means the alliance was perfectly hidden. If witnesses do not describe a shared doctrine, perhaps they were protecting it. If inquisitors failed to expose it, perhaps they never understood what they had found. That kind of argument cannot be defeated because it has protected itself from evidence. But it also cannot truly be proven. A secret so perfect that it leaves no reliable trace may satisfy fiction, but history needs friction. It needs something that resists the storyteller's hand. It needs a record, a contradiction, a pattern, a confession that survives careful doubt, a material link that does not dissolve when examined. With the Cathars and Templars, the confirmed picture remains more modest. They were contemporaries. They moved through some of the same regions. They existed inside the same crusading age. They were connected to noble networks that could be socially entangled. Both were later wrapped in accusations of heresy, though under very different circumstances. Their stories share themes of persecution, secrecy, religious authority, and institutional fear. Those themes matter. They help explain why the legend was born. They do not prove the legend true. There is a kind of disappointment in saying this, and it is worth admitting. The idea of a hidden bridge between Montségur and the Templars is narratively powerful. It would give the Cathar tragedy a secret continuation. It would make the Templars' downfall feel like the delayed punishment for something deeper than money and politics. It would suggest that beneath the visible church, another Christianity survived in guarded fragments, passing from burned villages to armed monasteries to coded symbols. It is a magnificent story. But magnificence is not a source. The real past is often stranger in a quieter way. What may have connected these groups was not a shared treasure, but a shared vulnerability to medieval systems of suspicion. Once an authority believes that spiritual danger hides behind familiar faces, it begins to interpret ambiguity as guilt. The Cathar believer who refuses to speak, the noble who hesitates to denounce, the Templar who meets behind closed doors, the order that answers only to the Pope, the community that keeps its own rules, all can become suspicious, though not for the same reasons. Power dislikes what it cannot easily inspect. That may be the deeper connection, and it requires no secret doctrine at all. The Cathars threatened the Church by rejecting its sacraments and exposing its moral weaknesses. The Templars threatened later political authority by being too wealthy, too independent, too international, and too useful until they were not. One group stood outside orthodoxy. The other stood inside privilege. Both, in the end, could be described as dangerous once describing them. That way became useful. So the evidence refuses to speak the line the legend wants it to say. It does not say, "Here is the alliance." It does not say, "Here is the doctrine carried from Cathar hands into Templar vaults." It does not place a hidden treasure safely into the keeping of warrior monks. Instead, it offers something more uneasy. It shows a medieval world where boundaries were porous, where accusations could travel faster than proof, where local loyalties complicated official categories, and where later memory could turn overlap into inheritance. The Cathars and Templars may have touched at the edges of society, but the bridge between them was built mostly afterward, not from stone, not from parchment, but from longing, suspicion, and the human refusal to let a tragic silence remain silent. Chapter 10. Montségur and the Last Fire. Montségur does not look like a place that should have carried so much weight. Seen from below, it rises with an almost theatrical severity, a hard crown of rock above the valleys, a fortress lifted into the weather. But the Montségur of 1244 was not the exact ruin that visitors walk through today, and it should not be imagined too neatly as a ready-made stage for legend. It was a living stronghold, adapted by need, fear, and faith. People moved there. Supplies had to be brought up. Messages had to be carried. Cold had to be endured. Decisions had to be made in cramped spaces by men and women who knew the world beneath them was closing in. By the early 1240s, Catharism had already suffered decades of crusade, confiscation, pressure, and pursuit. Its public protection had narrowed. Its noble supporters had been weakened. Its holy people had learned to move carefully, often by night, from house to house, from sympathetic village to sympathetic village. Montségur became more than a castle. It became a refuge for Cathar perfects and believers, a place where a condemned spiritual culture could gather under the protection of height. That height was both salvation and trap. In 1243, forces loyal to the church and the French crown began the siege. The mountain that had protected the refugees now isolated them. Every path mattered. Every slope became a calculation. A fortress can seem invincible from a distance, but a siege is patient. It does not always need to break the walls at once. It can wait for hunger, cold, fear, fatigue, and the slow collapse of possibility. This is where Montségur becomes the emotional center of the story. Not because it was the only place Cathar suffered, but because it gathers the larger tragedy into one visible shape. The whole long process, sermons ignored, crusaders summoned, towns taken, lords broken, families questioned, believers driven underground, seems to climb the mountain and stop there, above the clouds. Inside were not only warriors. There were Cathar holy people, ordinary believers, defenders, servants, and families bound together by different levels of conviction and necessity. Some had come because they believed deeply. Some because loyalty or kinship had brought them. Some because there were fewer safe places left. A refuge is rarely made of one kind of person. It is made of everyone who has run out of better choices, and beyond the walls, the besiegers were not merely waiting for a military surrender, they were waiting for submission. That difference matters. If Montségur had been only a fortress, its fall would belong to the history of siege warfare. But because it sheltered condemned believers, its fall became a test of the soul. The question was not only whether the defenders would lay down arms, it was whether the Cathar perfects and committed believers would recant, whether they would return, outwardly at least, to the church that had declared their faith a mortal error. A military defeat can be negotiated. A spiritual refusal is harder to absorb. As the siege dragged on through the winter, the situation grew desperate. The details have been retold many times, and later imagination has added its own polish. But the broad outline remains stark. Montségur could not hold forever. Eventually, terms of surrender were arranged. Those who recanted could live. Those who refused would die. There are moments in history when the distance between doctrine and flesh disappears. For the Cathar perfects, recantation was not a legal formality. To deny the faith at the final threshold would have meant accepting the authority of a church they believed had misunderstood the deepest nature of the world. It would have meant stepping back into the material and sacramental order they had spent their lives renouncing. For ordinary believers who chose to receive the consolamentum before the end, the decision was even more severe. They were not merely sympathizing now. They were crossing into the discipline of the condemned. The legend of Montségur often turns this into pure heroism, and perhaps there was heroism there, but it is more human and more painful to imagine the terror as well. Conviction does not remove fear. Faith does not make flames harmless. The people who refused to recant were not made of symbols. They had bodies, breath, memories, and perhaps last thoughts that were not grand at all. A name, a face, a hillside, a prayer repeated because there was nothing else left to hold. In March 1244, after the surrender, more than 200 Cathars who would not renounce their beliefs were burned. The place traditionally associated with the execution became known in memory as the Field of the Burned. Whether every detail attached to that memory can be recovered with certainty is less important than the fact that Montségur became almost immediately a wound. The fire did what fire does. It consumed bodies, ended voices, and allowed authorities to claim that justice had been carried out. But fire also transforms. It leaves behind ash, and ash is difficult material for power to control. Because after Montségur, the story did not become smaller. It became larger. That is the paradox of public destruction. It is meant to end a threat by making an example. Sometimes it succeeds politically. Catharism, as an organized, protected religious culture, never recovered its former strength. But as memory, Montségur became more potent than any living community could have been. A castle can fall once. A martyrdom can be retold for centuries. And then there is the rumor. According to later accounts, before the final surrender, something, or someone, may have escaped from Montségur. The details shift depending on the telling. A treasure carried down the mountain, sacred writings, money, names, the spiritual inheritance of the Cathars, the seed of a secret tradition. The more modern the version, often, the more elaborate the cargo becomes. This is the point where caution is not the enemy of mystery. It is what allows the mystery to remain honest. A besieged community might well have tried to move valuables, messages, or people through hidden routes. That is not impossible. In fact, it would be strange if no one considered it. But the leap from something may have escaped to a world-changing secret was passed into Templar hands is vast. The evidence does not carry us that far. It gives us a mountain, a siege, a surrender, a burning, and a memory thick with loss. The rest must be handled carefully, with clean hands. Still, one can understand why the rumor survived. If Montségur ended only with the fire, the story is almost unbearable. The idea that something escaped gives the tragedy a pulse beyond death. It suggests that the persecutors did not get everything. It allows later generations to imagine that the Cathars preserved some final witness, some hidden proof that their enemies failed to destroy. This does not make the rumor true in its grandest forms. It explains why people needed it. History often leaves grief unfinished. Legend supplies an exit. Montségur became the perfect birthplace for that legend because it combined everything memory requires: a dramatic setting, a doomed community, a moral confrontation, a final refusal, missing details, and the physical fact of a ruin watching over the landscape. Stand below such a place and the mind naturally begins to climb. It asks what was said in the last days. It asks who slipped away. It asks whether the fire consumed a heresy, or whether it merely gave a defeated faith a form that could survive without bodies. The answer depends on what we are asking. As a religious movement with open protection, Catharism was broken. As a symbol, it had only begun. Montségur did not prove a Templar connection. It did not reveal a treasure. It did not hand us a secret doctrine wrapped in smoke. What it gave the future was something more dangerous to certainty, an ending with gaps in it. And into those gaps, century after century, people would pour gold, grails, maps, bloodlines, codes, and forbidden knowledge. But before the treasure changed shape, before the Templars were drawn fully into the tale, there was simply the mountain, the surrender, and the fire. A final act of refusal high above Languedoc, where history ended one story and legend quietly began another. Chapter 11. The treasure that changed shape. A treasure is never just a treasure, not in a story like this. At Montségur, the word begins almost modestly. Something may have been carried away before the final surrender. That is the small, stubborn seed. From there, imagination does what imagination has always done around ruins. It adds weight, shine, danger, and meaning. A bundle becomes a chest becomes a secret archive, an archive becomes forbidden doctrine becomes the grail, the bloodline, the map beneath history. The trouble is that each version sounds more thrilling than the last, while the evidence grows thinner as the treasure grows larger. So we have to begin carefully with the simplest possibility. The Cathars and their supporters could have had valuables, not necessarily a glittering hoard, but money, coins, objects of practical worth, perhaps resources used to sustain people in hiding. A besieged refuge needed supplies and networks. It needed friends. It needed payment for messengers, protection, food, movement, shelter. If something was removed from Montségur before the end, it may have been less a mystical relic than an emergency reserve, the kind of thing that matters when survival depends on reaching the next safe house. That would still be important. A treasure does not need to be golden to be desperate. But the word treasure changes the atmosphere. It invites the listener to imagine locked boxes and moonlit escapes. It makes the final days of Montségur feel like the opening of a riddle rather than the closing of a tragedy. And because the Cathars left so few of their own records, the missing thing becomes available for almost any meaning later centuries wish to give it. Maybe it was sacred texts. That possibility has its own appeal. If the Cathars possessed writings that explained their beliefs from the inside, not through the hostile language of inquisitors and Catholic polemicists, then their loss feels especially painful. A hidden archive would offer the voice that history denied them. It would allow the defeated to speak without interrogation. It might correct misunderstandings, expose exaggerations, or reveal how varied their beliefs truly were. The desire for such a text is understandable, but desire is not discovery. We do not have credible evidence that a major Cathar library escaped Montségur and survived in secret custody. Cathar teachings did exist in written and oral forms, and some related texts are known through medieval transmission. But the dramatic idea of a complete hidden doctrine rescued from the mountain belongs more to later hope than firm proof. It answers a modern longing, the longing for the lost side of the argument. Maybe the treasure was not an object at all. It may have been names. This is less glamorous than gold, but in the world after Crusade, names could be more dangerous than coins. The identity of sympathizers, protectors, safe houses, routes, and families still loyal to the Cathar cause would have been precious information. To preserve such knowledge could help a network survive. To destroy it could protect people from arrest. To move it out of Montségur, if such records existed, would have been an act not of mysticism, but of strategy. Here, the imagination has to slow down. A list of names does not sparkle, but it could decide whether someone lived quietly for another year or appeared before an inquisitor. In a persecuted community, information becomes a form of treasure because information is the thread that connects the hidden to the living. Or perhaps the treasure was spiritual authority. This may be the most subtle possibility. A movement like Catharism did not depend only on buildings or wealth. It depended on transmission, the consolamentum, teaching, recognition, trust, the presence of those believed to carry holiness. If people escaped Montségur, who had received or could transmit the movement's sacred life, then what escaped was not a thing, but continuity. A faith under siege would naturally value the survival of those who could keep it breathing. This kind of treasure leaves almost no archaeological trace. It is carried in memory, gesture, prayer, and reputation. It can vanish inside a cottage, a road, a whispered introduction. It is easy for later legend to inflate, but it is also easy for modern skepticism to miss. Not every meaningful survival comes shaped like an artifact. Still, none of this supports the grander claims that have gathered around Montségur. The Grail, in particular, belongs to a different layer of imagination. Medieval Grail literature has its own complex history, and later writers found Montségur irresistible as a setting for that sacred mystery. The mountain was dramatic. The Cathars were persecuted. The fire seemed apocalyptic. Add the rumor of an escaped treasure, and the Grail almost walks into the story by itself. But that entrance is literary, not evidential. There is no solid historical basis for saying that the Cathars possessed the Holy Grail, or that it was smuggled from Montségur, or that the Templars received it afterward. These claims survive because they are emotionally and symbolically powerful, not because the medieval record securely supports them. They offer a more enchanted version of history, one in which every tragedy hides a sacred object and every defeat conceals a secret victory. The Rennes-le-Château style of speculation would later thicken this fog even further. Hidden treasure, coded parchments, priestly secrets, royal bloodlines, lost gospels, and Templar survivals all began to mingle in popular imagination. Once stories like these are combined, they become difficult to separate. Each mystery borrows credibility from the others. Montségur lends tragedy. The Templars lend secrecy. The Grail lends holiness. The south of France lends landscape. The result is seductive, but the pieces do not become proven merely because they look beautiful together. This is the work of myth-making. It turns association into implication. A castle near a legend becomes part of the legend. A persecuted faith becomes guardian of a secret. A military order with closed rituals becomes the perfect courier. A missing object becomes whatever the age most wants to find. And different ages want different treasures. For some, the treasure is gold, proof that something literal, measurable, and recoverable still waits beneath stone. For others, it is a book, the lost testimony of a silenced people. For others, it is a heretical truth, evidence that the Church suppressed a more authentic Christianity. For others still, it is the thrill of conspiracy itself, the belief that history is never what it appears to be, and that every official ending is a cover story. The Cathar treasure changed shape because the needs of its seekers changed. That does not make the legend worthless. Legends are evidence too, though not always evidence of what they claim. They reveal how later generations felt about the past. The treasure stories tell us that Montségur was not allowed to remain merely a site of defeat. People wanted something to have escaped because total destruction is difficult to bear. They wanted the burned to have outwitted the burners in some final way. There is a moral hunger inside that belief. And yet, a responsible telling has to resist the comfort of exaggeration. To invent a treasure too confidently is to use the Cathars again, this time for entertainment rather than persecution. It replaces their actual suffering and difficult beliefs with whatever modern fantasy sells best. They become guardians of someone else's secret, rather than people with their own severe and unsettling faith. What we can say is smaller, but not empty. A rumor of escape clung to Montségur. Some form of treasure may have existed, though its nature remains uncertain. It could have meant money, records, names, spiritual continuity, or later embellishment. The dramatic claims involving the Grail, or a direct Templar handoff, remain unsupported by credible evidence. The legend grew because the historical ending left silence, and silence is the most fertile soil a mystery can have. So the treasure changed shape because it was never fixed firmly enough to resist transformation. In one century, it could be a practical fund for fugitives. In another, a hidden scripture. In another, the Holy Grail. In another, a coded secret waiting for modern discovery. But perhaps the most haunting possibility is also the plainest. The true treasure of Montségur may have been the memory that something survived at all. Not a relic glowing in the dark, not a chest under a chapel floor, not a secret passed into Templar vaults. Just the refusal to let the fire have the final word. Chapter 12. The Inquisition's Quiet War. After Montségur, the war did not end. It changed its voice. The great armies had already done much of their work. Castles had fallen. Noble houses had been weakened or absorbed. Public protection for Cathar. Holy people had become far more dangerous than it had once been. The mountain had burned, and with it one of the last visible centers of Cathar refuge. But belief does not disappear simply because a fortress surrenders. It retreats into smaller rooms, a road at dusk, a kitchen where strangers are fed too discreetly, a dying bed where someone asks for the consolamentum, a family that remembers which cousin can still be trusted, a shepherd who knows a path over the hills, a woman who says less than she knows. This was the world the Inquisition entered. Not the Inquisition of later legend, with all its accumulated imagery and theatrical cruelty, but a medieval system of investigation that grew in part because armies were too blunt for the work that remained. Catharism could no longer be treated only as a military problem. The networks were too hidden, too domestic, too personal. If the Church wanted to dismantle what survived, it needed information. So the battlefield narrowed. It moved from walls to words. Inquisitors came with questions, procedures, records, and the authority to turn memory into evidence. They asked who had seen a perfect, who had hosted one, who had received a blessing, who had attended a consolamentum, who had guided someone from one village to another, who had eaten with whom. who had failed to report what they knew. The questions could reach backward for years. That was part of their power. A conversation that once seemed private could become dangerous long after everyone thought it had passed. A small act of kindness, offering bread, shelter, a blanket, a warning, could be recast as participation in heresy. Under this pressure, ordinary life became searchable. There is something especially cold about this phase of the story. Siege warfare is brutal, but visible. You know where the army is. You can see the banners, the machines, the fires, the men at the walls. The Inquisition worked differently. It entered the past. It made people revisit meals, visits, funerals, friendships, family obligations. It asked them to arrange their memories in ways that authority could use. This did not mean every inquisitor was a cartoon villain, or that every record is useless. In fact, inquisitorial registers are among the most important sources for understanding the last generations of Cathar life. They preserve names, relationships, roots, fears, habits, and fragments of speech that might otherwise have vanished entirely. But they preserve them inside a machinery of coercion. That is the difficulty. The records illuminate, and they wound. A witness might speak from genuine repentance, another from fear, another from exhaustion. Another might protect one person by naming another. Some may have lied. Some may have told partial truths. Some may have forgotten details and supplied what they thought the questioner expected. In a world where the wrong answer could bring punishment, truth rarely walked into the room alone. This is why these documents must be read with care. They are not pure Cathar testimony, but neither are they simple fiction. They are pressure marks. Like footprints in wet ground, they show movement, but they also show the weight that made them. Through these records, we can glimpse how Catharism survived after its public defeat. Not as a grand hidden church with secure command, but as fragile networks of loyalty. Perfects still traveled. Believers still received them. Families still arranged meetings. Some people remained deeply committed. Others hovered at the edge, afraid to let go of old ties, afraid to hold them too closely. The faith continued not because it had armies, but because it had relationships. And relationships are difficult to kill cleanly. The Inquisition understood this. Its quiet war was not only against doctrine, it was against trust. A secret religious movement depends on the belief that your neighbor will not speak, your cousin will not betray, your servant will not repeat, your host will not collapse under questioning. Once that trust begins to fail, the network weakens from within. That may have been more effective than fire. Fire creates martyrs. Interrogation creates suspicion. A village under inquiry becomes a place where memory itself feels unsafe. People begin to wonder who has talked. They become careful with invitations, careful with prayers, careful with grief. The dying person who wants consolation may endanger everyone who gathers nearby. A family that once saw a perfect as a holy visitor now sees a risk entering through the door. This is the slow dismantling of a culture, not always by spectacular violence, but by making ordinary loyalty too expensive. One of the most important things to understand is that the Inquisition did not need to find every believer in order to succeed. It needed to make belief socially costly, logistically difficult, and emotionally dangerous. It needed to break the habits that allowed Catharism to reproduce itself. Hospitality, teaching, transmission, family memory, confidence in secrecy. A movement can survive persecution if enough people still trust one another. It begins to die when trust itself becomes evidence. And yet the surviving voices are not only voices of fear, they also reveal stubbornness. People remembered perfects with tenderness. They described visits in language that suggests reverence, not mere obligation. Some continued to seek the consolamentum at death. Some protected others as long as they could. Even under hostile questioning, one can sometimes feel the outline of affection beneath the official categories. That is what makes these records so haunting. They were designed to expose and correct heresy, but they also accidentally preserved the humanity of those they pursued. A woman remembers who came to the house. A man remembers carrying a message. A family remembers kneeling. A neighbor remembers pretending not to see. These are not the grand materials of legend. They do not glitter like treasure or thunder like crusade, but they bring us closer to the real Cathar world than many of the later myths do. The mystery here is not a hidden grail. It is the question of how long a persecuted faith can survive inside gestures small enough to escape notice, and what happens when even those gestures are recorded. The Inquisition's victory was gradual. Catharism did not vanish overnight after Montségur. It thinned. Its roots became more dangerous. Its holy people fewer. Its believers more isolated. By the early 14th century, surviving pockets still existed, but the movement had lost the social depth that had once made it so threatening. Without open protection, without stable networks, without enough perfects to transmit the faith, it became harder for each generation to reach the next. This is how a religion can die in public while still breathing in private, and it is also how history inherits a distorted silence. The more successful the repression became, the fewer Cathar voices survived except through those who questioned them. Later, when people searched for the truth of the Cathars, they often found not Cathar books, but Catholic records. Not free testimony, but answers shaped by fear. Not a complete doctrine, but fragments retrieved from rooms where no one spoke without consequence. That silence helped create the later legend. Where records are incomplete, imagination enters. Where victims are heard mostly through their interrogators, modern readers begin to suspect that the most important things were never written down. Sometimes that suspicion is wise. Sometimes it becomes a doorway to fantasy. The quiet war of the Inquisition left both evidence and emptiness. It gave historians names, dates, and details. It gave legends missing spaces to fill. And somewhere between those two inheritances, the last Cathars disappear from view, not in one final blaze, but in the fading of safe houses, the breaking of roots, the aging of believers, and the moment when a child no longer knows which prayer had once been whispered beside the bed. Chapter 13. The Templars become the accused. For nearly 2 centuries, the Templars had stood inside the machinery of Christian power. They had guarded pilgrims, fought in the East, managed estates, moved money, held castles, advised rulers, and buried their dead beneath the sign of the cross. Their authority came from the church. Their privileges came from popes. Their reputation had been built on the idea that violence, when disciplined by vows and directed towards sacred ends, could become service. Then, suddenly, the servants became the suspects. The fall of the Templars did not happen in the Cathar age, but it belongs beside it in memory because it shows how quickly sacred status could be reversed when power found a use for accusation. By the early 14th century, the order was no longer what it had been at the height of crusading confidence. The Crusader states in the Holy Land had collapsed. Acre had fallen in 1291. The great military orders still had wealth, land, and influence, but their original purpose looked less immediate and more vulnerable to criticism. A military order without a battlefield is not harmless. It becomes a question. What are these men for now? Why do they own so much? Why do they answer to no ordinary lord? Why do kings owe them money? Why do they meet behind closed doors? Why should an armed religious corporation, international and privileged, continue to exist when the dream that created it has failed? These questions did not automatically doom the Templars. Institutions often survive long after their founding purpose changes, but they created an atmosphere in which resentment could gather. And resentment, in the hands of a determined ruler, can be given legal shape. That ruler was King Philip IV of France, often called Philip the Fair. The name sounds almost gentle, but there was nothing soft about his political instincts. Philip was a king who understood authority as something to be tightened, defended, and expanded. He had already clashed with the papacy. He needed money. He disliked powers within his kingdom that did not bend easily to royal control. The Templars, wealthy and papally protected, were exactly the kind of institution that could become intolerable once a king decided they were no longer useful. On Friday, October 13th, 1307, Templars across France were arrested. The date has become famous far beyond its original context, helped by later superstition and popular storytelling. But the real horror does not need embellishment. Men who had belonged to one of Christendom's most honored orders woke to find themselves treated not as defenders of the faith, but as enemies hidden within it. The charges were shocking: denial of Christ, spitting on the cross, obscene initiation rituals, idolatry, corruption, and other acts meant to make the order appear not merely flawed, but spiritually inverted. These accusations mattered because ordinary misconduct would not have been enough. Greed, arrogance, or military failure might justify reform. Heresy justified destruction. Here the echo of the Cathar story becomes hard to ignore, though it should not be misunderstood. The Templars were not proven Cathars. Their fall does not reveal that Cathar doctrine had secretly entered the order. The accusations against them do not provide a hidden bridge back to Montségur. What the episode reveals is something colder. The category of heresy had become one of the most powerful tools available for turning protected people into punishable ones. Once a group could be described as heretical, normal loyalties weakened. Property could be seized. Confessions could be demanded. Public disgust could be cultivated. The accused could be placed outside the sympathy their former service might otherwise have earned. That is what happened to the Templars. Under imprisonment and torture, some confessed. Others denied the charges. Some retracted what they had said. The record became a tangle of fear, pain, procedure, and politics. A confession produced under torture tells us something, but not always what the interrogator wanted it to tell. It tells us that bodies break. It tells us that institutions can manufacture the appearance of truth by making denial unbearable. It tells us that a statement signed in terror may reveal less about secret ritual than about the power of the room in which it was spoken. This does not mean every Templar was innocent of every failing. No large medieval order was pure in practice simply because its rule was wholly on parchment. There may have been abuses, arrogance, corruption, private misconduct, and internal habits that outsiders would have found strange. But the spectacular charges that destroyed the order have to be treated with caution. They were produced in a political atmosphere where the king had much to gain, and where the accused had very little freedom to speak safely. Pope Clement V, pressured by the crisis and by Philip's forceful campaign, eventually dissolved the order in 1312. The wording and procedures mattered to church lawyers, but the larger reality was clear. The Templars as an institution were finished. Their properties were reassigned, their name blackened, their brothers scattered into imprisonment, retirement, or absorption elsewhere. An order that had once embodied crusading devotion had been legally erased. Then came Jacques de Molay. As the last Grand Master of the Templars, he became the human face of the order's end. In 1314, he and Geoffroy de Charnay were burned in Paris after retracting their confessions and asserting the order's innocence. Later legend would gather around Molay with enormous force, turning his death into a curse, a prophecy, a final act of defiance cast upward against king and pope. As with Montségur, we have to be careful. The later stories are often more polished than the evidence allows. But even without the embellishments, the scene is powerful. A man who had led one of the most famous orders in Christendom died by fire as a condemned criminal. The symbol is almost too stark. The Church's warrior, burned under accusation of betraying the faith he had sworn to defend. This is why the Templar fall became such fertile ground for conspiracy. The facts already feel incomplete. The charges seem excessive. The confessions are contaminated by torture. The king's motives look suspicious. The pope appears compromised. The order was rich, secretive, and international. Its end came suddenly, dramatically, and profitably for others. No wonder later generations asked whether something deeper had been hidden. But here again, caution matters. A political destruction does not require an occult secret. A false or exaggerated charge does not prove the opposite fantasy. The Templars did not need to possess Cathar treasure, the Grail, or forbidden doctrine in order to be dangerous to Philip. Their wealth, independence, and symbolic power were enough. That may be less romantic, but it is more frightening, because it means the machinery that destroyed them did not require magic. It required paperwork, prisons, fear, legal language, public accusation, and a ruler willing to turn suspicion into policy. This is the real echo between the Cathars and the Templars. Not a proven shared faith, not a secret inheritance passed from mountain refuge to military order. The echo lies in the way authority can define a threat, surround it with moral panic, extract words under pressure, and then present the result as purification. The Cathars were destroyed because they stood outside orthodoxy. The Templars were destroyed after standing too powerfully within it. That difference is essential, but the ending has a similar shape. Accusation, isolation, confession, fire, and then legend rushing in where trust in the official story has failed. By the time Jacques de Molay died, Montségur had been ash for 70 years. The Cathar world was already fading into records and rumor. Yet the Templar fire gave later imagination a second blaze to set beside the first. Two condemned groups, two histories of suspicion, two endings by flame. The human mind does not like parallel tragedies to remain separate, so it tied them together. Chapter 14, From Heresy to Conspiracy. Long after the last Cathar believers disappeared from the records, Their story refused to stay buried in the form historians could prove. That is not unusual. Defeated communities often live two afterlives. One belongs to the archive. Dates, interrogations, legal acts, names written by hostile hands. The other belongs to imagination. Songs, rumors, local pride, political longing, spiritual hunger, and the strange human instinct to believe that a people destroyed by power must have possessed something power feared. The Cathars had all the ingredients required for a second life. They were persecuted. They left too few of their own words. They lived in a region with a strong identity and a wounded memory. They were connected to mountains, castles, hidden roads, and a final fire. Their theology was difficult enough to be misunderstood, and their destruction was dramatic enough to be romanticized. Over time, the actual Cathars, severe dualist Christians with a demanding view of the world, were slowly transformed into something more flexible. They became rebels, then mystics, then guardians, then, finally, keepers of secrets. Almost anything could be placed inside. This transformation did not happen all at once. It accumulated. Medieval memory, local tradition, religious polemic, antiquarian curiosity, 19th century romanticism, occult speculation, and modern popular culture each added a layer. By the time the Cathars reached the age of paperbacks, television documentaries, and internet mysteries, they had become much easier to admire and much harder to recognize. The same happened to the Templars. Their historical order had been Catholic, military, wealthy, administrative, and deeply tied to crusading. But after their destruction, they too became available to imagination. The charges against them had been strange. Their confessions were compromised. Their wealth invited speculation. Their rituals had been private. Their end had been violent. The order had disappeared, but its name remained useful, perhaps the most useful name in all medieval conspiracy. If a secret needed guardians, the Templars could guard it. If a treasure needed transport, the Templars could carry it. If a forbidden doctrine needed an underground network, the Templars could provide one. In this way, the Cathars and Templars became partners less in medieval fact than in modern storytelling. Each supplied what the other lacked. The Cathars supplied martyrdom, purity, southern tragedy, and the suggestion of lost spiritual knowledge. The Templars supplied organization, wealth, mobility, military discipline, and an aura of closed-door ceremony. Together, they formed a nearly perfect engine of mystery. But the engine runs better when evidence is left behind. That is why Montségur became so important. A ruin on a high mountain is already an invitation. Add a siege, a mass burning, and a rumor of something escaping before surrender, and the place becomes almost impossible for legend to resist. It does not matter that the supposed treasure is uncertain. In fact, uncertainty helps. A known object has limits. An unknown object can become whatever the storyteller needs. The Grail was one of the most powerful additions. In medieval romance, the Grail belonged to a symbolic world of knights, purity, sacred testing, and divine mystery. It was never originally a Cathar relic waiting in a Pyrenean fortress, but later writers found the association irresistible. The Cathars, imagined as spiritually pure and persecuted by a corrupt church, seemed like natural guardians of a hidden holy object. Montségur, with its dramatic height and final fire, seemed like a natural Grail castle if one was willing to let poetry outrun evidence. and many were willing. Occult reinterpretations pushed the story further. Cathar dualism, already difficult and fragmentary in the sources, could be recast as secret wisdom. The Templars' initiation ceremonies, poorly understood and blackened by trial records, could be recast as esoteric rites. The destruction of both groups could be explained not by theology, politics, money, and power, but by the possession of forbidden knowledge. This is the moment where conspiracy becomes emotionally satisfying. It tells us that persecution had a hidden reason. It tells us that institutions do not merely crush dissent, they crush truth. It tells us that the victims were not only victims, but chosen custodians of a revelation still waiting to be decoded. It gives moral order to violence by suggesting that the powerful were afraid because the weak knew something. That is a compelling story. It is also a dangerous shortcut. The Cathars did not need to possess a lost gospel to be persecuted. Their actual beliefs were already enough to alarm the medieval church. The Templars did not need to inherit Cathar secrets to be destroyed. Their wealth, independence, and political vulnerability were enough to make them targets. When conspiracy adds a hidden master key, it can accidentally flatten the real causes that made these events possible. It makes history more magical, but less responsible. Rennes-le-Château helped intensify this modern atmosphere. A small village in southern France. A priest associated with strange wealth. Stories of coded parchments, hidden treasure, bloodlines, and sacred secrets. All of it formed a kind of mythic magnet. Around that magnet, older elements gathered. The Cathars, the Templars, the Grail, lost documents, royal mysteries, and the idea that the south of France concealed an alternative history of Christianity. The result was not one theory, but a family of theories. They changed shape from author to author, each borrowing pieces from the last. Some versions leaned religious, some occult, some political. Some were presented as investigation, others as entertainment, and many lived somewhere in the profitable twilight between the two. Popular culture did the rest. Once a mystery enters novels, films, late-night documentaries, games, and online forums, it becomes less a claim than a mood. The details matter less than the feeling. The castle above the valley, the monk with a secret, the knight with a hidden oath, the parchment in a church wall, the treasure smuggled through moonlit hills. These images are powerful because they are cinematic. They are also easy to confuse with the past. A viewer may first meet the Cathars not as medieval duelists, but as noble guardians of wisdom. They may first meet the Templars not as crusading monks with estates and accounts, but as masked keepers of forbidden rites. By the time the historical record enters, it feels almost disappointing. Real people are always less convenient than symbols, but they are also more interesting. The real Cathars were not modern freethinkers with a medieval accent. Their beliefs about the body, matter, and salvation were severe. The real Templars were not wandering occult superheroes. They were members of a disciplined Catholic order shaped by crusade, privilege, and administration. The tragedy of both groups does not depend on making them something else. In fact, the effort to make them glamorous can obscure what is most revealing. The Cathar story shows how a religious culture can become intolerable to an institution that believes it alone guards salvation. The Templar story shows how an institution once protected by sacred power can be destroyed when political power finds accusation useful. Together, They reveal not a secret doctrine, but a recurring pattern. The fear of hidden contamination, the usefulness of heresy as a charge, and the way silence after violence invites later invention. That pattern is enough. It does not require a grail. It does not require a coded bloodline. It does not require a secret tunnel from Montségur to a Templar vault. The romance of the legend lies in imagining that the past still contains a locked chamber. The discipline of history lies in asking whether the key was ever there. Sometimes, after the questions have been asked carefully, what remains is not a conspiracy, but something quieter and more unsettling. A record of real people destroyed, then remade by centuries that needed them to mean something new. The Cathar-Templar connection grew because the ashes left room for it, and where there is room, the imagination builds. Chapter 15. What the ashes actually reveal. So what remains after the fire, after the trials, after the treasure stories have been unfolded and held up to the light? Not proof of a secret Cathar Templar church, not proof that Montségur hid the Grail, not proof that the Templars received a forbidden doctrine from the last Cathars and guarded it until their own destruction. The evidence does not carry us there. It brings us close enough to understand why the story was tempting, then stops before the bridge becomes solid. The Cathars and Templars shared an age, a geography, and eventually a reputation for forbiddenness. They moved through some of the same noble networks. They were both swallowed by accusations of heresy, though in very different ways. But overlap is not alliance. Echo is not inheritance. What the ashes reveal is something less glamorous and more disturbing. They reveal how medieval power dealt with what it could not comfortably absorb. The Cathars challenged the Church from outside its sacramental order. They denied the goodness of the material world, rejected Catholic authority, and lived in ways that made official holiness look compromised. The Templars, by contrast, stood inside the Church's machinery for generations. They were its armed servants, its privileged sons, its international instrument of crusading devotion. Yet when they became politically vulnerable, the language of spiritual corruption could be turned against them too. One group was dangerous because it refused the system. The other became dangerous because it had grown too powerful within it. That is the true connection, not a hidden doctrine, but a shared fate under the pressure of suspicion. The Cathar story shows us a faith slowly crushed by crusade, confiscation, and interrogation. The Templar story shows us an order destroyed by accusation, torture, royal pressure, and legal dissolution. In both cases, fire did not only punish bodies, it attempted to settle meaning. It declared that the question was closed, the error exposed, the threat removed. But fire is poor at controlling memory. After Montségur, people kept asking what escaped. After the Templars, people kept asking what they had really known. These questions survived not because the evidence was strong, but because the endings felt too violent, too useful, and too incomplete. When institutions destroy their enemies with great confidence, they often create the very doubt they hoped to erase. That is why the legend endured. It gave the Cathars an afterlife beyond defeat. It gave the Templars a secret deeper than disgrace. It allowed later generations to imagine that somewhere beneath the official record, the condemned had preserved a truth too dangerous to name. And perhaps, emotionally, that is easier to bear than the plainer possibility that human beings can be destroyed not because they hold a world-changing secret, but because their existence becomes inconvenient to power. The romance of the Cathar-Templar connection is built from real materials, real persecution, real secrecy, real noble entanglements, real accusations, real missing voices, real flames. But the pattern made from those materials belongs largely to later imagination. The legend is not worthless because it is unproven. It tells us what people wanted the past to contain. It tells us that silence feels unbearable when it follows injustice. It tells us that ruins invite rescue stories. Still, the dead deserve more than our fantasies. The Cathars were not merely symbols of hidden wisdom. They were believers with difficult, severe, deeply religious convictions. The Templars were not merely occult shadows. They were a powerful Catholic military order caught in the collapse of their purpose and the ambitions of a king. To make them partners in a perfect conspiracy may be thrilling, but it also flattens them. The truth is more human. They became linked because both histories left behind the same emotional residue, the feeling that something had been condemned before it was fully understood, destroyed before it was honestly heard, and remembered afterward by people who no longer trusted the voices of the victors. So the central question does have an answer, though not the one legend prefers. The Cathar-Templar connection is not a buried truth proven by the record. It is not simply nonsense either. It is a legend built from ashes, from proximity, fear, silence, accusation, and the deep human need to believe that what was burned was not entirely lost. And maybe that is why Montségur still holds the imagination. Not because a treasure is waiting beneath the stone, but because, on that mountain, history teaches one of its oldest lessons. Power can end a life, an order, even a faith. It cannot always decide what the ashes will mean.